YouTube, we are live. So I'll just give us a brief introduction to our interview today. So my name is Hayden Sloan. I'm the Strategic Director of Communications for Race to Zero Waste. And we are here for the last interview of Zero Waste Month. So hopefully you have seen a couple of our other interviews. If you don't know me yet, you've missed out on our other interviews because I've been on those. And so they are on our YouTube channel. Feel free to go back and watch some of those. And make sure that you post what you've learned about those interviews and this one. If something comes up that you think, wow, that's a really good way of thinking of something, post it on your social media of choice. Use the hashtag Zero Waste Month and let us know what you're learning throughout this month. It's your last day to get in actions during this sprint. So if you have a zero waste action that you would like to share, go ahead and share those as well. And let's get into this interview as we wrap up Zero Waste Month. Very exciting. We have 3 interviewees today who I'm gonna spotlight now, who are gonna share their expertise with you about different campaigns against incineration, incinerators, and the dangers of incineration, among other things. So I will let them introduce themselves. If during the interview, if you're on YouTube, if you have a question, go ahead and put it in the chat. We have a Race to Zero Waste staff working on that. And if you are on Zoom, we'll open the chat up over the last 10 or 15 minutes to take questions. And you can also go ahead and put them in the chat as we go along, whichever you prefer. So let's get into introductions. Tracy, would you like to go first?
Sure. So I'm Tracy Frisch. I live an hour north of Albany, New York, so near Vermont, the state of Vermont, in an area near a lot of old industrial development along the Hudson River. And we are now fighting a 33-year-old trash incinerator, which is no longer even needed by the 2 counties that originally built it. And we also have I would say, very successful all-volunteer zero waste effort that has gotten some major policy changes in the county we work in.
That's great. Thanks, Tracy. And Shlomo?
Right. Thanks, Hayden. My name is Shlomo Dowen. I'm the National Coordinator of the United Kingdom Without Incineration Network. It's in the title. We have a vision that we cling to of a UK without incineration. It's, if you like, we're impulsed by that future that we're working towards. And the first step is to stop new incinerators being built. We've had success both in Wales and Scotland. And we're pressing on now for England and Northern Ireland to join the moratorium on new incineration capacity, and then we can go for an incineration exit strategy proper. So, and I'm just so glad to be here. Thanks so much for inviting me.
That was great. And thanks for sharing that kind of flow of the process. We might get more into that as we go through the conversation. And Mike?
Hi, everyone. I'm Mike Ewall. I'm the founder and executive director of a national organization in the US called Energy Justice Network. Just dropped all my information in the chat, so please connect with me there. Someone else is talking. I've been working since about 30 some years ago in helping folks around the country fight off dirty energy and waste industry facilities. I've had a special focus on waste incineration, but I've also helped fight gas and coal plants and nuclear facilities and you name it. If it's a dirty.
Sorry, that was my fault. I was trying to mute people who were unmuted and I accidentally muted you.
All good. So I've been very focused on getting the last, I can say now 62 trash incinerators in the US closed, as there are 2 more that'll bring that number from 64 down to 62 in the next 2 months. And hoping to do that in the next decade so we can move on and take on some other industries. Well, I've still got some miles in me, but that's what I do, and I'm looking forward to questions.
All right, awesome. Well, thank you all for introducing yourselves. Let's get right into it. Why are we closing incinerators? What's the big deal? So I'll let whoever would like to take that on first.
Who wants to go first?
Go ahead, Mike.
Okay, all right, try and step back a little bit. All right, I'll jump right in. So trash incineration is the most expensive and polluting way to manage waste or to make energy. It's more expensive and polluting than, oh, other people are disappearing. Okay. It's worse than coal power plants in terms of pollution. It's worse than directly going to landfills because it makes landfills more dangerous by putting toxic ash in them after making the air more toxic by putting toxic air pollution out, as well as greenhouse gases. So it's actually worse for the climate, worse for health, worse for environmental justice, worse on basically every measure that there is, except for the amount of land that is taken up compared to using landfills directly. And so happy to get more into those details in the Q&A, but definitely have a lot of information to back that up if anyone's curious.
It's also the most expensive. And often trash incinerators brag that they're waste to energy, that they're producing electricity. They produce a tiny, tiny amount of electricity, and it's the most expensive and the dirtiest way to produce electricity. So I think that's really important for people to keep in mind to counter that greenwashing.
Yeah,
Yep.
absolutely. And Shlomo, I'll let you add something too.
Yep. Just a couple of things to add. We talk about dirty. By that, we not only mean, shall we say, conventional pollution and diminishing air quality, but also in relation to climate change. Folk out there may or may not be aware that when something is burnt, then it combines with oxygen. The carbon in whatever is being used as feedstock combines with the oxygen to produce CO2. There's so much carbon stored in plastic that when you burn 1 ton of hard plastic, you release more than 2 tons of CO2 for every 1 ton of hard plastic that you burn or more. So from a climate change perspective, incinerators should be shut down. And then also incineration is a barrier to the circular economy. So we talk about the linear economy, take, make, and destroy. The taking actually is very environmentally harmful. And so if we can take less from the earth, then we're doing better. Making also is very wasteful. And then at the end of life, destroying. Whereas a circular economy allows for resources to be used time and again. So what we're looking for is a more circular economy, and incineration is not only a leakage from the circular economy, but also a barrier to achieving that circular economy. So it sounds like incineration is a pretty bad thing from what everyone's saying here.
Another problem with incineration is incinerations are hungry for garbage. So they encourage the production of more garbage because they need to be fed continuously. And so initiatives to increase recycling, to reduce waste generation, to increase composting are frowned on because they're in direct competition to incineration. Most incinerators, I believe, and Mike, you can correct me if I'm wrong, that have been built in the United States have contracts with counties or towns or other jurisdictions to feed them. They're called put or pay contracts. And so if they don't send enough garbage to the plant, they'll burn recyclables. They will penalize the contractee, the county or city that has a contract for the incinerator. So it's really totally in contradiction with zero waste, plus for the reasons that Shlomo discussed.
Yeah, I mean, the UK government did a study of incinerator feedstock, and it found that more than 90% of what was being used for incinerator feedstock in the UK was either recyclable, compostable material, or what they call substitutable materials. So really, as has been said by many people, even if incinerators could be made safe, which they're not, they couldn't be made sensible. And I think that there's consensus around that, at least amongst the guests that you've invited today.
Yes, and the places that argue that trash incineration can be done cleanly, can be done a certain way that, you know, if you add enough widgets on the smokestack, it becomes acceptable. What that's doing is it puts you in it's a lose-lose situation. you have to spend more money than it already costs. It's already the most expensive way to manage waste and the most expensive way to make energy in the US, at least. However, if you add the additional pollution control devices to meet stricter standards like we see in other countries, in some cases, that means you're spraying more chemicals into the exhaust. So you have to mine more limestone, get more carbon for carbon injection, get more natural gas base from fracking, usually urea or ammonia to spray into the exhaust. So you have extraction just to use the materials in the control devices. Costs a lot more. And then you have more ash, and you're moving pollutants from the air to the ash, making the landfill more toxic than it already would be when you put the ash there. So you spend more money than you can afford on something that just moves the problem instead of avoiding the problem.
I think those are all really important points. One of the things that I want to ask is, what do we say to people who consider incineration like a stopgap measure? Like, yeah, we need to get to the circular economy, but in the meantime, what do we do with all this junk that is really difficult to recycle? Isn't recovering a bit of energy out of that a good thing? Like, I'm seeing like, smile, like knowing smiles. Go ahead,
Right.
Tracy.
It's not easy to to shut down a trash incinerator. They live on and on. I mean, they're dead equipment, but they're very hard to shut down. So you can't do a simple, quick stopgap measure, number one. And the ash will be landfilled for forever, polluting yet another area. But much of this so-called waste that we think we've got to get rid of is not really waste. And that's the first step. You know, if in 5 years, I would wager that any political jurisdiction with a will to do so could reduce the waste that goes to a landfill or incinerator by 50%. You would need a strong grassroots organization to help inform them, and you would need the political will. But I think that's possible in many, many places. We didn't think anything was possible in Warren County, which is a mostly Republican county. But people are grateful to our group, who are elected officials, and they're listening.
And we build on that answer from Tracy. It takes a long time to even get one built. I'm right now in South Florida, where they're close to picking which of 4 communities of color to build the largest incinerator in the US next, and that's 4,000 tons per day. And they're saying that it will take 10 years just to build a new one. That's without the massive opposition that's already coming and will delay it to the point of killing it. They've not been able to build a new incinerator at a new site in this country since 1995, despite hundreds of attempts. They built one next to an existing facility, but can't get a new community to accept one. The high cost, though, prevents the real solutions, because it would cost, in this case, this 4,000 ton per day plant, they're talking about $1.6 billion to build. At a fraction of that cost, you can, within a few years, build a lot of zero waste infrastructure to avoid the need for that much disposal. But it's not better than going straight to a landfill. And that's the big misconception. People think landfill's bad, landfill's bad. Yes, landfills are bad. Incinerators and ash in landfills are worse. And that part is what folks don't get. And once we get our leaders to really see the science on that and understand it, it makes it easier to say, okay, let's use the landfills we already have and feed them as slowly as possible, which is not an option when you have an incinerator, because as Tracy pointed out, their put or pay clauses in their contracts say, feed us or pay us as if you did for that amount of waste.
Yeah. I mean, something important, and just building on what's been said already, is about what I call per stream thinking. The idea that you look at products, you instead of saying everything that people throw away is potential incinerator feedstock, you look at it more closely and say, well, wait, there's all this organic material, that food waste and other things that rot and that then have nutrients that can feed the soil. So if you incinerate that, you're losing all those nutrients, as well as using incinerators unnecessarily. So when it comes to, which can be between a third and half of what goes into incinerators, if you remove that, you've already freed up a lot of capacity at existing incinerators, and you've rescued the nutrients, etc. Then we talk about plastics. Plastics should never be incinerated. As Mike said, landfill is bad, incineration is worse. If we don't want to extract more oil to produce ever more plastic, then the plastic we've got should be looked at as a resource. And that means that if we store it, whether we store it above ground in warehouses, whether we store it below ground in landfill sites, and I'm thinking not of the, shall we say, conventional landfill sites, but landfill sites of the future where things are sorted much more thoroughly and then stored in containers, so that way, when future generations want to use that material as a resource, they've got that as an option. Let's remember that the definition of sustainability is being able to meet our needs in a way that isn't at the expense of future generations. And so if we bequeath future generations a legacy of plastic resources that then become economic to recycle in the future, or are used for 3D printers or whatever it is, then that becomes a resource. If we burn it, then we're leaving future generations with exacerbated climate change and without the plastic resources that they could make into something new. So these are all arguments for why we certainly shouldn't have any new incinerators. Arguably, we can make better use of the incinerators we've got, but as soon as you remove the food waste, as soon as you remove the plastic, a lot of what you're left with can be recycled, if it's paper, if it's card, if it's wood, or it's material that doesn't burn, like glass, ceramics, grit, etc. So it's hard really to see that there's a role for incineration. Certainly, incineration is not part of the circular economy.
Great. Yes, I would say if we keep these things out of the waste stream, they will free up space in our landfills so that we can be landfilling the things that cannot be recycled or composted. Like the food waste will also reduce methane if we're recycling, if we're composting rather than using anaerobic digestion, which generates methane, a very potent greenhouse gas. I want to make another argument that a lot of the infrastructure we talk about for recycling and composting, for the collection of recyclables, the sorting and stuff, and aggregation, so it could be sent to a mill to be actually recycled, as well as composting, is those investments. I see in the county that we're working on, they're trying to get grants, although they have committed to match the grants with county taxpayer money. So that's good. But if they would just invest in some of this infrastructure out of their own funds, they would still be ahead. Because if you compost, make quality compost, you can sell the compost. If you take sorted recyclables and you bale them, and then you aggregate them in tractor trailer truckloads, then mills will come pick them up and pay you good money up to, I mean, the amount of money fluctuates with the markets, but up to $150 per ton for used corrugated cardboard. So it can be very good money. Aluminum cans go for well over $1,000 a ton. I mean, it might be, I can't tell you off the top of my head, but so that infrastructure is affordable if you do this in the public sector. If you're trying to get a private sector company to do it, they will do single stream collection where all the recyclables are mixed up and then have to be sorted, are totally contaminated, and that's a mess. So if you do it right, you can actually pay for it in many cases.
Yeah,
I think there are two directions there that we want to go. So one is the anaerobic digestion direction, which somebody already asked about on YouTube. Thanks, Tiny Green Adventure. And then the other direction is finding the policymakers, political will to make this change and get this done instead of going toward incineration, because clearly they've been sold incineration. So first, maybe anaerobic digestion. Is that
Well,
an incineration point? Like, how does it work? Is it a good solution?
I don't believe anaerobic digestion is a good solution because it generates methane. And I think we're better off not using black boxes. So anaerobic digesters, when they're large, are quite expensive and they generate methane. Someone's making money because you're buying this enormous piece of equipment. In the US, anaerobic digesters, the main uses are at CAFOs, concentrated animal feeding operations, factory farms, especially dairy, and they subsidize the dairy, these industrial dairies, by taking the manure and making it a smaller volume for dealing with. And the electricity may or may not be purchased because if you generate electricity or the methane that you produce is dirty, so it can't just go into a natural gas pipeline. It has to be cleaned up first because it's corrosive, I believe. Might be wrong on the corrosive bit, but it's not pure. The other place is at wastewater treatment plants, and I'm a sewage sludge activist. Sewage sludge is highly contaminated with toxics, including PFAS, always PFAS, especially from industrial sources, but also from consumer products. And at wastewater treatment plants, anaerobic digesters take the sewage sludge. They're also in many places, including New York City and Boston, and somewhere in upstate New York that I haven't pinpointed yet. Food waste is mixed with that, creating a larger volume of contaminated materials. And then they're often sent to farms to contaminate the farmland. So also I'm involved in, through the Sierra Club, there's going to be an anaerobic digestion webinar later this month. And I can put my email. If you email me, I will send out the information. It's on Tuesday, November 19th at 2 p.m. Eastern Time.
Perfect. That sounds great. Yeah, please put that in the chat and we'll have our staff disseminate as well. I know there's definitely interest in understanding anaerobic digestion, and so thank you for that. Mike.
Yeah, I'd like to add to the AD issue. So we take a more Energy Justice Network, we take a more nuanced position on digestion in that there are some places where it's appropriate, some places where it's not. And that's largely dependent on whether the feedstock is something that is clean enough to go back to the soil or is too contaminated and rightfully belongs in a landfill. And so we draw the line in saying for food scraps, yard waste, which we usually call source separated organics when we actually separate them and don't put them in trash cans, that is higher up on the zero waste hierarchy, which I just put in my last comment in the chat. That's in the composting section where we should be diverting those. I have to answer this question. Where we should be diverting those for aerobic composting to avoid the methane generation. The same thing with animal waste at farms and such, that can go to an aerobic composting method, which would be preferable. Although a lot of farms, at least in the US, due to federal subsidies for digestion, are moving toward digesting some of that to get credits for the energy that they can sell. But the place in terms of municipal solid waste where it makes sense for digestion to take place is at the end of the hierarchy, the step right before the landfill. And that's where you want to biologically stabilize that waste, because you don't want it getting gassy, stinky, and leaky in the landfill. It's hard to capture the gases out of landfill with getting the whole amount of it. Some always escapes. And so if you put it in a digester, that's basically like composting in a vessel. You can capture all the gas or almost all of it. Some leaks out, but for the most part, you can capture it much better. And you're doing this largely to reduce the volume, the weight, the water weight will be gone. And so you have less to ship to a landfill and to make sure the landfill is not so gassy and stinky. So this is appropriate for sewage sludge and for the organic fraction of municipal waste, the stuff you didn't keep out of the trash can and it got in there and now it's got nail polish remover on it and all kinds of other stuff contaminating it and the microplastics. You don't want that back on a farm field. So that belongs in a landfill, but you want to stabilize it with digestion first.
Yeah. And I want to jump in for the second question that you were asking about influencing policymakers.
Yes, please.
So we have a model that is top down and bottom up at the same time. So from the bottom up, you need the grassroots, you need, if you like, the electorate, the voters, to be able to impress upon their elected representatives that this is an issue for them. And members and supporters of UKWIN have been fantastic when it comes to writing to their representatives. We do what we can to make it easy for them, but without that involvement at a grassroots level, without the communities themselves involved, then it is very hard to counterbalance the industry influence. So for a politician to find their political will, to use their political power, it needs to be in combination not only with, shall we say, the grassroots, but also with education. So there's a role that we have in educating decision makers. And that's always a challenge because we can't sort of lavish them with gifts in the way that the industry might, but we can impress upon them not only our passion, but also factual information. So a lot of it is fact-based. UKWIN makes a big effort to always show our sources. So when we make an assertion, we have a source so that people can trace it. And what it means is that people often don't quote us, they quote the sources that we have pointed to, and that suits us fine. We want to get those arguments out there. It isn't about promoting UKWIN, it is about promoting a UK without incineration. So that works well. Obviously, we are, although we're no longer part of the European Union, we're part of the continent of Europe. And what that means is that we can point to good practice elsewhere. Denmark, for example, has a kill list. The Danes, that's their sense of humor, I suppose you could say. A kill list for incinerators. So their incineration exit strategy is fairly highly developed, and they're looking at the oldest and least efficient incinerators being got rid of first. But also we need to scare away investors. It's often the case that planning permission, permits, etc. are granted, but unless there is the money there to invest in those incinerators, and unless there is some kind of assurance that those incinerators will make a profit, they could end up being stranded assets. That spooks the markets. They don't want to pay a lot of money for something that isn't going to bring a return on their investment. And so we try to promote the idea that we draw attention to all of the failed incineration projects and help to educate potential investors that it's a bad idea and they shouldn't be parting with their money. And there are all kinds of things going on, certainly at a European level, with respect to the emissions trading scheme and including incinerators in the emissions trading scheme. That increases the costs and therefore reduces or hopefully eliminates the profits. But also there's another strategy that we use, which I call the Godzilla versus King Kong. Basically, if you are faced with an opponent of overwhelming power, you aren't going to be able to go up against it yourself. But if there's another opponent also with overwhelming power, then if they can go at each other, I appreciate it wreaks havoc on the transport infrastructure. I've seen the films. I know the downside to it. But the good news is that in the UK, there is what we call the fight for feedstock. So what we are beginning to see is incinerator company versus incinerator company violence, shall we say. So incinerator companies have now, for the first time, openly started objecting to proposals from competitors. And what that demonstrates and what we're able to do, we're able to highlight that, and we're able to say, this proves our point. There isn't enough waste to go around, and so they're having a go at each other. And that is a victory. It's a victory for us. If you like, not only is it a moral victory, but it also means that resources that instead of being directed to undermine our arguments are being directed actually making our arguments in opposition to other incinerator proposals. So all of those then can be brought to the attention of decision makers who can then begin to rethink their positions, and that's got to be seen as a good thing.
Can I ask you to repeat the question so I'm answering the right question, Hayden?
Sure, yeah. Just in the sense of educating policymakers and getting policymakers to really use their political will toward something that isn't incineration.
Okay, so what I would like to share is that we've been working mostly locally at the county level. There's only 66,000 people in the count in this particular county. But what they were not aware of is that they're wasting a lot of money and they're fiscal conservatives, or at least make that claim. And so when we are able to show them that the towns lost over $500,000 last year by not selling their recyclables. And this doesn't cost what they paid to get them transported and what they paid in some cases to get them resorted, even though they were already sorted. So we're talking about a lot of money, and we got this estimate at current prices from a startup company that works in recycling deserts. So they broker recyclables and they know what the costs are, and they advise communities and municipalities and others who want to work with them. But I think what's really important is to get as much data as you can, understand the system, and look at alternatives and be able to present some kind of economic case, because they're just doing what's easy. The county procurement officer and the elected officials did not know that there were markets for recyclables. So they were paying up to I think it was $125 a ton to get rid of corrugated cardboard when it had a value that same year peaked at $150 a ton. So a $275 a ton spread. And I would guess, probably I would bet that this is not unique to this county, that many counties have the same situation, and many cities. And also many counties just said, it's easier, we're just going to privatize, and they're throwing all that money away.
Those are excellent numbers. And like if there's a report that you'll have that includes those that folks could use as a resource as they're educating their policymakers, if y'all have all of you, if y'all have any of those that you'd like to put in the chat, please do, because that's exactly what we need. Like, I'm imagining me going before one of my, council members, or whatever your local or statewide policymakers are, and saying like, yeah, incineration's bad. Then I want to have something in my hand that shows like the data, right? So please, yeah, y'all, if you have reports or data or papers or anything, please let us know. Shlomo's added the UKWIN facts. Thank you.
Because we're a grassroots group, maybe it's a poor excuse, but we don't, I could look for it and send it to you afterwards, but I can't look for it right now.
Yeah, so sure. Afterwards is fine too, to have it as a resource later.
We do have some commodity prices, but and someone posted something about microplastics and medical waste. I would like to make the argument that certain things should never be recycled or composted, and that we need to really keep high on our list of priorities and principles to do no harm. And toxics are a huge concern for me. I do not want to compost sewage sludge. I do not want to compost things that will contaminate the soil. And I'm really quite skeptical of plastic recycling, and not just advanced recycling or chemically recycling, which I totally oppose, which often uses pyrolysis and other failed methods, high heat methods, to create a mess, a new contaminated substance that might be used as fuel, which is a real disaster. But I'm skeptical of plastic recycling because of all the microplastics involved with that. Many types of medical waste can be, we throw everything out. A while back, when people in upstate New York were fighting medical waste incinerators, I'm talking 30 years ago. Every hospital had a medical waste incinerator. Autoclaves were recommended to basically control the pathogens. And I haven't followed the medical waste situation. Oh,
I
and
was going to make mention of one thing about medical waste because I went to a project actually in Nepal by HACAF 360. They help out hospitals with autoclaving the medical waste, getting it sorted, not sorted into like 3 bins. No, we're talking like 30 bins for the different types of medical waste. And so they have this like little, building outside of the hospital that they autoclave everything and then they sort it. And then that goes to like they're able to recover those materials. It goes to a recycler. So those like plastic gloves, like it may seem like nothing, but then once you have like 30,000 plastic gloves, then you can do something with it. And so I didn't go to the next step, which would be finding out exactly how those are recycled, but being autoclaved and sorting medical waste is an option and they've proved it.
Right. And it's not a high income country, so it should be doable in many places.
I mean, it's a great point generally, Hayden. She who sorts wins. That's a phrase that we use as well. And the idea is that, again, something that can influence both citizens and decision makers is that if you take as an example a pile of old computers, that's junk. But if you sort it out so that you've got a handful of microchips that can be reused, that has value. And so generally speaking, there's all sorts of what can be called mixed waste. But as soon as you start sorting it, and exactly as Hayden was saying, the more categories, the better, because then you get into specifics and then again, back to per stream thinking. And it's not just a stream of plastic. I mean, obviously, and I think that we're all getting to the core of this, is that we need to turn off the plastic tap. There isn't going to be an end of pipe solution for plastic that is as good as not making all the plastic in the first place and making better use of the plastic that we've got. So if we call time on plastic, then suddenly there will be more innovative ways to use the plastic that we've got. And that is better than continuing to extract and continuing to do all of the processes that are themselves toxic that give rise to the plastic in the first place. Earlier, we talked about climate change and the adverse impact of burning plastic. In effect, plastic is carbon capture. The carbon is stored in the plastic. As soon as you burn it, the plastic is, then the carbon is released. And then even if you put some kind of carbon capture mechanism to the incinerator, you're only recapturing a tiny proportion, if any, of the original carbon that was already stored. So you've got your carbon capture, and it's a matter of taking a more responsible approach to plastic. There is a concept of extended producer responsibility, and the idea that those who profit from the plastic should be the ones who are paying for it, et cetera, et cetera. Obviously, it's a great principle, but the application of it is, shall we say, imperfect. But it's a problem that should not just be seen as, shall we say, the fault of the consumer. We've got to trace it back to the producers. And I think it was Pete Seeger who said that if you can't reuse it or compost it or recycle it, then it shouldn't be sold. It shouldn't be made and it shouldn't be sold. And that's obviously part of the solution.
It was also Pete Seeger, or maybe another Hudson Valley singer-songwriter, who said, it really isn't garbage till you mix it all together. It really isn't garbage till you throw it all away. And that should be our principle. I want to talk a little bit about, well, sometimes we call things recycling and they're not really recycling. They're scrapping, they're downcycling, and electronic recycling is a perfect case in point. I'm working with a group It's retired GE engineers, which is interesting, but they are, it's not an advertisement for GE. So, but they for 28 years, they've been rehabbing computer equipment and donating it to schools and nonprofits. Now that is a solution. They're giving back to the community. They're enjoying themselves. I've been the organizer of 2 drives. We spent 3 or 4 hours collecting stuff at our food co-op. You know, people would drop it off. This time we got like 2 or 3 times as much computer stuff. 2 layers in a pickup truck. We're going to do it again a couple times next year. He's going to need a bigger pickup truck.
That's great. I love that. I just want to say that we did have an e-waste interview last week. So if anybody wants to find out about like e-waste and really dive into like why we need to recover these materials, separate out all of the pieces of computers, I think that would be a great interview to go through. I do want to try to focus us a little bit more on the incineration topic, but thank you, Tracy. I love that initiative. Since we just have, you know, like maybe 10 minutes left of the interview before we get into questions, I wanted to ask specifically about the environmental justice component. So Shlomo mentioned EPR, extended producer responsibility. And so I want to kind of tie that into the environmental justice component as well. Like, can producers take responsibility for the impacts that these items, not just the production, but also later the end of life solutions or not that we're seeing?
I actually oppose EPR in most, especially for packaging. I totally oppose it for packaging. I support bans, and I think we just need to build our political power. EPR for packaging competes with recycling, has had negative impacts on bottle bills. And it gives these producers a license to keep producing. It may be different under certain circumstances. I'm mostly familiar with Canadian examples. But incinerators like environmental justice communities. I think we would all agree on that. I
think probably Mike has a lot to say about that, but continue.
So there are 64 commercial trash incinerators in the US left operating. There'll be 62 by the end of this year. And of the 64 that are currently open, 63% of those are in majority white communities. And so, flying in the face of a lot of the storytelling on this, it's not true to say most incinerators are in environmental justice communities. However, there is a strong environmental racism trend in this industry, and you need to look at it by the community they're in terms of how many people are impacted, as well as the size of the facilities. If you look at just the whole industry collectively and account for the fact that the bigger ones are in more urban communities affecting more people of color, then across the entire industry, you find Black people in particular are most disproportionately impacted, and there's a very strong environmental racism trend to this industry. But if you're ignoring how big they are and where they are and just saying, okay, how many are in certain communities, then if you look at the largest of them, correct my sentence a little bit. If you do look at size, the top 25 incinerators in terms of size in the US, about 60 to 65% of those are in communities where it's a majority people of color. And so it's the biggest ones, it's the clusters of them. That's where you see the environmental racism trend most distinctly in this country. And it's an awful trend. And we see this right now going on, like in South Florida, where they're trying to build new ones. Every community is a community of color that's being targeted. So it's a serious issue. Just be careful not to repeat some of the claims, like 80% are in communities of color. There's stuff out there saying that. That's just incorrect information. And feel free to reach out to me for the current and accurate details.
I just want to clarify, by environmental justice, I do not mean people of color. I mean communities that are already impacted by toxic sites, as in, the area that I work in, and typically lower income than the surrounding areas.
Yeah, let me actually clarify on that a bit. I'm sorry, Shlomo.
You're good, Mike.
Then tells it to you. The idea that just as many of these are in poor white communities is Not so accurate. Race is much more of a factor than class in this industry and a lot of them. So there are lower income white communities like the one Tracy's organizing in where you'll find some incinerators. But for the most part, it's not that they're targeting poor communities. They are targeting communities of color for the bigger plants that there are. And you see situations like in Connecticut where they had in recent years 5 incinerators, one of the big ones shut down, but 3 of the 3 smallest ones are in more rural communities of white communities in those cases. But the 2 big ones, each of the 2 large ones are in cities where it's mostly people of color living, and the 3 small ones in white communities, if you add their sizes up, they're not as big as either one of those 2 bigger ones in communities of color. And that's a simplification of what you see in the geography of this whole industry.
I think we can say that they're not going to rich communities, right? They're not going to the most affluent communities.
Definitely.
I mean,
Shlomo, what do you
certainly-
see in the UK?
Yes. So the UK experience is very much class-based on so many levels, but decisions about where incinerators are located in the UK correlate both to race and class. It appears that would-be incinerator operators prefer to impose themselves on communities that are more vulnerable, that are the least able to defend themselves. Occasionally, we do see incinerators proposed for more affluent areas, and those proposals are more likely to be refused permission, refused a permit, refused planning permission. In stark contrast, former coal mining areas, like where I live in Nottinghamshire, and neighborhoods with higher proportions of Black and minority ethnic residents are far more vulnerable to incinerator applications. So part of the planning system here in the UK is that if you have an area that is industrial, then you say, oh, well, one more industry, it just themes in. Whereas if you have a more affluent area, then they say, oh, we must protect the beautiful view and all the rest of it. So that's part of the mechanics of how it happens. And actually, addressing this sort of injustice alongside doing something to start bridging the huge imbalance of resources available to waste companies as distinct from, shall we say, communities, is a big part of my personal motivation to work for UKWIN. And it's a big reason why UKWIN exists, is to try to at least begin. We can't cancel it out, but we can at least begin to bridge that gap in terms of resources and in terms of justice, because what goes on here certainly isn't fair.
Absolutely. And so we're seeing that, across countries, the idea of people who are more vulnerable are being targeted for these types of projects. And so wherever you live, for the audience who's listening, whether you're in a more affluent community or whether you're in a more rural community or a more low income community or people of color or white folks, like whatever your situation may be, then the idea is to support the fight against these incinerators wherever they're going to be located. So if it's right next to you or if it's 2 towns over from you, let's work on fighting those together. We have about 10 minutes left of our interview, so I do want to open it up to questions. If anyone on the Zoom has a question and you'd like to raise your hand and ask it like out loud instead of putting it in the chat, please feel free to raise your hand or unmute your mic.
Yes, we answered everything.
I feel like this conversation could go on for a while, like so many
For sure. No,
passionate responses. It's amazing.
I'd love for that to be the case. I mean, I do want to jump in with something while people are gathering their courage. And that is urging everyone to try on for size the identity as a circular citizen. I think that this identification or what could be called conscientiousization, where it's something that you do deliberately, I think that has a lot of power. It adds power to the action that you're already taking because it gives a sense of purpose. It gives a sense of as I say, kinship with other fellow circular citizens. We're all circular citizens here, or we wouldn't be participating in a race to zero waste event. And that's good, because I can tell you for sure that even though the Godzilla versus King Kong analogy holds, they also act as a cartel. There are waste companies that are very cozy, very friendly with each other, as well as with decision makers, etc. We need to build our own community. We need to build our own movement, and identity is a big part of that. And intent is very important. So it's not just a matter of saying, "Ooh, I'm going to buy this product because it's in glass rather than plastic." It's a matter of saying, "I'm definitely going to favor glass over plastic every time, because that's part of what we collectively do as circular citizens." Right? I can see that there are people who want to raise their hand but can't find their hands. So I'll be
Yes, it seems like it. Okay. I'll let Colin go. Go ahead. I see your hand raised. And then Mark in the chat has said, can't find the hand raiser, but I'm going to say that that's you raising your hand. So Colin first and then Mark. I think you're talking, but you'll have to unmute.
You're on mute there, Colin, but not for long.
Hayden, can you ask him to unmute with a button?
Yes, I've done it now. Thanks, everybody. And hi, Shlomo. And I know Shlomo very well. I communicate with him almost on a daily basis recently. And I'd like to confirm one of the things that have been mentioned. It's not a question, it's just confirmation, because that they put these incinerators in already in deprived areas, because I was discussing our local incinerator, which is the biggest in the UK. And as Shlomo knows, I've been opposing it for 14 years now, and my predecessor was opposing it being built for 11 years. So our campaign's been going on for an awful long time. Now, I was talking to one of our councillors last week at one of the drop-in centres, and she's also a member of the Development and Control Committee, which, if you're not familiar with the US and the UK, that's where planning applications are actually considered. And I complained to her about the nuisance that our local incinerator was causing, and for the benefit of some people there, that residents can't live in the houses that face the incinerator. They got to sleep in the back bedrooms because of the noise and the smells that come out. So, and I complained to her, and she actually said to me, "Well, it's already an industrial area, so what do you expect?" So that's the kind of problems that we come across, where the local councillors who determine where such plants are actually located already do what everybody suspects they do, is just say, "Well, it's all right because you're already in an industrial area." But to actually illustrate how stupid these people are, the local industrial area where she's complaining, where she's mentioning, all the local industry is gone now and there's none there. So, I mean, these people just use any excuse just to deprive people who are living in already poor areas. Well, it wasn't a poor area, to be honest. It's just that since the incinerator was there, and it's about 50 yards from people's front doors, and it's the largest in the UK. And the people, you try to get help from your local representatives, and they're just not interested because it suits the council to actually get rid of its waste in a cheaper manner. And also, they probably get rates from the incinerator as well. So
I think that illustrates the point perfectly, that these, that incinerators find, whatever place that makes sense for them without thinking of the community, and the politicians are either bribed or somehow convinced, or clearly even express themselves that they don't care about their constituents, which is just awful.
Actually, to be perfectly candid, but I mean, we'll not go there.
Definitely. I would like to let another person have a turn. Thank you, Colin, for illustrating that point so well. I'm going to hand it over to Mark right now.
Yes, it was just a quick one. I put it in the chat actually, but it's we have a lot of volunteers, and our aim is to try and give information in a clearer way to local communities, because a lot of it is quite obtuse. But one of the things I've always been confused about is about EPR, and also about its link with deposit return schemes, because although the theory seems brilliant, I think, as Tracy said, it hasn't worked. And I think one of the problems with that is vested interests have a marvelous way of twisting things in their favor. And so we set up systems to try and drive resources into waste management, but they always seem to get subverted. Now, is there a way around that, or am I being a bit too optimistic or unrealistic or naive? Because anything we try and do to get industry to cut back or to do something, they always seem to find a way around it. But anyway, that was my point.
Yeah, I think we just need to build power and demand bans, and not compromise. And I think, unfortunately, well-meaning people, well-meaning organizations go for EPR, but there's no accountability for EPR. These laws are very complicated. They typically have producer-run organizations that are managing them and setting the rules. They're opaque. And our environmental agency in the state of New York exercises no environmentally favored discretion on industrial facilities or recycling, and I don't see how they could ever enforce anything to the benefit of the public and the environment. So we're basically turning it over to these corporations, and I just think it was a good idea that got kind of co-opted, and it just continues. So.
And I think, Mark, you were the one who mentioned the Global Plastics Treaty. I think that's part of what activists and advocates have been pushing for, is a ban on plastics, because the fossil fuel industry is looking for that increase until 2020 or until 2050 in the production of plastics, to compensate for loss in profits from fossil fuel energy. So that's part of, I think I definitely agree with Tracy there. Like, that's part of what we need to do too, is like get these bans in place or caps on plastic production.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, of course, the vested interests are really launching into the Global Plastics Treaty as well, and trying to subvert everything in that. But
of course,
I guess it's the emphasis on regulation, transparency, and all that lot that we've got to keep pushing for, I guess. But thanks very much. That's very helpful.
Thank you, Mark.
There's many efforts to ban single-use plastics and get away from that. I think we're at a stage where I was just on Cafeteria Culture's website, and they're promoting an end to single-use plastics in school cafeterias. I think we're at the stage of organizing and demonstrating that this stuff is possible, that everyone used to do, 40 years ago, and now we have to show that it's actually possible to do. But these are building blocks towards ending this stuff, I hope.
Definitely. And so, just to bring it home, we have just like 1 minute left. I see that there's still some conversation going on in the chat, so that's perfect. Thank you, Mike, for answering some of the questions that have come up over there. And as I said, if you want to add more resources in the chat, please go ahead. But just in our last minute, I would like to give each of you like another, few seconds just to say, what is the one big thing that we should do as individuals to be able to fight incineration, to be able to help reduce this and be part of this zero waste community in an activist way, or whatever thing you want to say for the last minute. Sorry for the motorcycle in the background if y'all heard that. Mike, go ahead.
So the number one thing you can do as an individual is to not act as an individual, is to act in a group and to get connected with others who can work on this together for institutional change. Because as much as we do all the individual things and produce little waste ourselves, if our neighbors aren't doing it, if the incentives and programs aren't there and the infrastructure isn't there to make it possible for everyone, then we can all be proud that we're saints, but we're not fixing the system. So join with the rest of us. If you live anywhere near an incinerator or a proposed one, or where your waste goes to one, or you just want to find another way to plug in, please get in touch with me. I would love to help you just get more organized in your own community if you're not already, or if you are, I can find other ways to help you. My information, if you scroll up in the chat, you'll find it. And last thing I'll say is on relation to one of the questions that was in the chat about transportation, don't let anyone convince you that burning close to home is justified because the diesel trucks are so big because they're going to have to drive so far to get to a landfill. That is not true. The transportation impacts are tiny compared to landfills or incinerators, and incinerators are that much worse that there's no locational argument to be made for having to travel, having to build closer to home and do the wrong thing rather than travel to the less bad solution.
I'll go next, I guess. I would say the first thing to do is find out where your waste goes. Find out where your recycling goes. Find out if there's opportunities for composting. And if there aren't, if there are things that you find objectionable along the lines of things we've talked about, then get involved. And you might have to take a stretch and go beyond your comfort zone and talk to people you're not that are not familiar to you, to speak up at government meetings and such. But you will make new friends. You will find a new life. It will be very exciting when you win, and you can win. And if you can't win in the one fight you're doing, then work on another fight so that you get the satisfaction of winning, and then go back to the first fight. Do not get discouraged. Okay.
Speaking of winning, let's toss it over to UKWIN.
Right, excellent. Yes, no, and very deliberate in terms of neurolinguistic. We chose that name deliberately, and we are all winners. The very fact that we care puts us in front, and I suppose that the big message is don't buy into the idea that you are less rather than more because you care. It's challenging, it's difficult, and exactly as Mike and Tracy were saying, we need to feel part of a community, part of a movement, and the movement needs you. So you are very much needed. Everyone who's on this call, thank you for caring about it. Everyone who watches in the future, thank you for caring about it. Use the resources. Don't swallow the rubbish. Don't swallow what you're being told. Spit it out and do your own research. Come to your own conclusions. Don't trust those who've got a financial incentive to sell you something, because chances are they won't be telling you the whole story.
Thank you so much. I think that was a great way to round us out. And thank you to our three interviewees. Y'all were amazing. Thank you so much for your passion and the advocacy that you bring to this work. For those of you in the audience, thank you for attending. Thank you so much. Y'all can go ahead and jump off of the Zoom call and of the YouTube. Just make sure that you post #ZeroWasteMonth. Let us know what you learned or what your take-home message was from this interview, and definitely check out the previous interviews, and we'll see you for the next sprint to zero waste in